Have you ever been in a beautiful, loving, fulfilling relationship that culminated in a dumpster fire? Turns out, dumpster fires are easy to start when you are one. And I was one. My behavior was a recipe for heartbreak, a splash of secrecy, a helping of infidelity, left lover after lover in my life heading for the hills, and me with a head full of questions. It was time for me to man the hell up and take some damn responsibility for the person that I had become. And with that came a line of inquiry. I had to ask, how did I become that guy? The legendary toxic male, the one who all of the blogs and the articles and the poems are written about, right? I was a textbook playboy who was born a one-woman man. I remember loving with all of me. Like in college, I was so loyal to my girlfriend, I didn't cheat in my dreams because I didn't know that I was sleeping. True story. That's who I am originally. And I'm guessing that a lot of men are too. In fact, I'm willing to bet that almost every so-called toxic male was born as a baby boy with a heart of gold. What kind of pressure does it take to crack those golden hearts, and does that pressure change across culture? I genuinely want a world where our women, our femmes, are safe from this kind of toxic crap, and I'm guessing that you do too. And in order to get that world, I'm going to propose a novel and somewhat risky idea that masculinity is inherently not toxic. It's an inevitable natural energy that regardless of your biological gender, when filtered through our culture, the toxic elements are rewarded. And those elements are combustible, like a raging dumpster fire. For me, in my life, there was an agonizing string of romantic disappointments that I allowed to turn me toxic. Full ownership of that, right? And when I shared my heartache with some very close homeboys of mine, they lovingly told me to stop being a little simp, to get over my ex by getting on top of the next. That's culture. We'll get into that in a minute. But in a wounded state, that message is appealing. And when you drown your sorrows in a box of condoms, nobody tells you that it becomes an addiction. I fell down the slippery slope of tears, lube, and lies. Just about as hard as I fell in love. And selective honesty is as addictive as opioids, and it's breaking just as many lives. When I saw lover after lover drowning in tears, it dawned on me that something had to change, and it was me. You see, I realized that more than being the source of their pain, I was the source of a great deal of my own. And every time it fell apart, I was increasingly lost. And at my lowest, I found myself literally sobbing uncontrollably in a fetal position on the floor with just enough strength to call my buddy, who was an Afghanistan vet. Of all my partners, I knew that Staff Sergeant Lacey McDonald understood the kind of depression with no end in sight. He took me over to his house for a change of scenery, and sipping a beer on his couch in the smoldering ashes of yet another catastrophic romance, I sifted through the rubble, and when I found that they were never coming back, I processed my guilt through the magic of writing a 2-page suicide note. On a legal pad, I penned what I thought would be my last words to this world, and with every line, my heart just got lighter. Unexpectedly, the more honest I was about my life, the more I felt that life was worth when I started taking some accountability for it. Now, this was a minor miracle that did not have to happen. I woke up the next morning after my best sleep in weeks, and my remorse gave way to a realization that my actual life was so much bigger than my mistakes and the sad narrative on that page. And to think that I was about to end it all because of a story in my head. I had hope, but I needed direction. And more than that, I needed therapy, okay? So, like we all do. I humbled myself and just got help. And at my specialist request, I meditated daily and found that I could exist without thinking at all. What a concept, right? That freight train of thoughts driving my life off the rails was actually the source of my toxicity, and I could stop that. And so much clarity comes in that silence. I began to examine my ideation and found that I was not alone. In fact, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention states that 47,173 Americans ended their own lives in 2017. For context, that is enough to fill up the Barclays Center, Madison Square Gardens, and still have 7,000 souls left over. And in 2014, and since that year, they have tracked a steady increase in the suicides of black men. Men, after breakups and divorces, are statistically more vulnerable than women, effectively executing the act at 3 to 5 times the rate. In other words, I was in way more danger than I knew, okay? See, sometimes, ladies, that toxicity that we throw into y'all's lives ends up backfiring and destroying our own, not every time, but often, right? Gendered factors included men's higher rates of substance abuse, our acute reaction to perceived failure, and not asking for help. Here's a shocker, y'all. Men compartmentalize, right? To a deadly extent. But why? Well, maybe our culture for centuries made this kind of emotional split in men necessary. It starts early. From the first time we're socked in the face or tackled and told to suck it up and not cry, we are fractured. Well, in a conscription society where men could be drafted into combat to charge up a hill and die in a hell of gunfire, we needed a lifetime of practice acting in spite of our feelings. The safety of the nation depended on it. But just because he comes back in one piece doesn't mean that he's not shattered. Plus, heartbreak is just a trauma that our culture doesn't prepare men very well for. When straight men fall in love for the first time, it is usually not with the woman that we will marry, and we are encouraged from every angle to practice sex without our hearts involved. The split continues, and that compartment takes on a life of its own. Well, I didn't realize that this was a gendered privilege. Ladies know that as soon as they act out sexually the same way the men do, the slut shaming is a-coming, right? Because they don't have that privilege. And privilege seems to be a hard conversation to have with men. Add race to that equation and prepare for battle. It's hard enough to get white men to acknowledge their privilege. Even with them making up 44 of our 45 presidents. Even with their faces on all the currency and Mount Rushmore on land they're not indigenous to. And even with them making up the majority of CEOs and military high command, they still struggle with this idea that this culture privileges them. Just a 400-year coincidence, y'all keep on winning, right? Okay. So imagine talking privilege with black men. Whew, the historically oppressed do not react well when confronted with their role as oppressors. Okay, brothers got to aggressively clapping their hands like, where's my privilege, bruh? You know what I'm saying? Privilege to be 40% more likely to be killed by the police. Privilege to have 1 in 3 of us incarcerated at some point. Privilege of being racially profiled and followed around stores. Privilege of being guilty until proven innocent like the Central Park 5. I had those exact same questions when I was confronted with the idea. And then a black feminist that I know, she said, Theo, when was the last time you were actually afraid of being sexually assaulted? I was like, well, you know, most of my life is spent walking the streets trying to convince people that I'm not about to do that to them, so. She said, answer the question, brother. I said, well, the only time I was ever afraid of that was during a short stint that I spent in jail. She said, well, every woman you know is in jail. This realization hit me like a ton of bricks, all right? And, I mean, honestly, I had never considered that there was another gender and culture intersection, right? You see, like many young black men, I grew up in an area that was overshadowed by gang violence, right? Growing up in the crossfire was traumatizing, but it gave me a bridge to a necessary conversation. You see, if you try to talk to the average hood fella from around my way about toxic masculinity from a feminist lens, you're likely to get cussed out and dismissed. But if you say to him, brother, toxic masculinity is the reason for almost every funeral in the hood. It is part of the reason why if you get murdered, it will be most likely by somebody who looks just like you. Well, then you got the chance to hear, all right, bro, you got 30 seconds to sell me on this crap. What's up? How do I know? Because we took this conversation to the streets. I called a community forum in some barbershops to discuss the idea of black men and privilege in relationship to the treatment of our women, right? And we talked about female physical and sexual safety, was led to talking about culture, was led to talking about the music we grew up under. Guys like Tupac, Notorious B.I.G., Snoop, the infamous Dr. Dre, no shade to their accomplishments, but let's just say they weren't necessarily influenced by the feminist literary revolution, okay? Their ability to treat even the finest women as disposable added to a cool factor that is yet to wear off. I didn't realize how toxic that was. And then we talked about our blind spots as black men. Like many of us had never considered that in a racist, patriarchal society, crap rolls downhill, as my father used to say. Historically, black men came home from taking a day of racism to the face, and everybody smaller than us paid for it, starting with our women, who themselves had just taken a day of racism to the face, right? And then, due to the attention paid to the very real war against our bodies, black women's narratives were swept underneath the rug. Now we had to make space for their narrative and the wounds they've accrued from racism and our sexism. And then we brought black women into the room, and we talked about our common history and the road to lie ahead. And then a brother raised a hand and was like, yo, check, man. If toxic masculinity is hyper-aggressive and domineering behavior, is toxic femininity when women reward that behavior with their bodies and affections? He said that his love life had consisted of women passing him up for the more thuggish types. That heartbreak made him more like the men who he got dismissed for. He said that his very first crime in life was resembling his father, for which his mother emasculated him for daily, which showed up in his relationships with women. Doesn't this also have to change if we want healthy masculinity in our communities? And I was like, oh. I got quiet and I thought about it, and I was like, brother, hurt people. This is all part of a cycle. And I said, be careful where in that cycle you want to begin that blame game, because we will only end up spinning our wheels. Perhaps the courage to rise above this toxic cycle with women will be a truer test of your manhood than anything you ever received from another man. This seemed to land, and if we move forward with the understanding that women asserting their narratives is a phenomenon that is here to stay. Fellas, this is how we detox. Understand that toxic masculinity does seek to conquer the world. Healthy masculinity seeks to master the self. So whether that looks like getting you some therapy or getting some meditation in your life, some self-reflection, go ahead and do that, all right? And for me, this looked like when I started dating again and found somebody I was actually excited about, telling her about my past from day one and letting her decide whether she wanted to move forward with me or not, okay? This also meant that, like, I had to not end up in extraneous women's direct messages on social media. And actually, like, when I found myself in a conversation with another woman that I was attracted to, bringing up my girlfriend to set that boundary, okay? That was a huge one for me. The thing about it is that it's all about integrity. Root word, integrate. These compartmentalized lives that we've been leading, men, have to be brought back into unity. You gotta be one dude, fellas. And if you don't think that these compartments are bleeding into one another, your self-deception is a time bomb in a dumpster, okay? And you don't wanna have to see it go up in flames like I did. And by the way, Just because I can stand on this stage and pontificate about my progress, don't mean that I forever got this thing beat. Like an addict, this is going to be my work for the rest of my life. But we cannot end the war on women until we're at peace with ourselves. And that's just it, fellas. For the most part, we don't love ourselves. Like, we can muster up some self-respect every now and then, but that's about it. We live in a world where men are in pain and we're conditioned to think that nobody cares. And people who think that nobody cares if they're in pain destroy shit. Black men feel this pain acutely due to our history of emasculation. Therefore, correcting us by simply condemning us is becoming increasingly ineffective. Like, we know when somebody doesn't actually care if we get better. Perhaps the fastest way to a man's heart is to acknowledge that he has one in the first place. Maybe you're right, ladies. Men are like dogs. And any dog trainer worth their salt knows that beating a dog is the worst way to train it. You train with love, incentive, and reinforcement of the right behavior, reversing the destructive tendencies. Fellas, this goes for us too. Like, beating ourselves into greatness has failed for a reason. Because for too long, masculinity has been defined as the ability to control and dominate our world and the variables within. When those variables turn out to be our women and our children, it is bound to fall apart. Therefore, ladies, any privilege that comes at your expense is a privilege that I don't want. In time, all parasitic privilege crumbles because, as it turns out, you can never find heaven making hell for someone else. If you want to help humankind, start by being a kind human. It all begins from within. And when we get it right, it is my belief that healthy and accountable masculinity just might be a girl's and the world's best friend. Thank you.